Welcome to Your Mythology Book Club. I'm your host, Daniel. In each episode of this series, we'll do a close reading exploration of one book of the Iliad until we've covered all 24 of them. This is episode 3, and so we'll cover book 3. As always, I'll be reading the most critical parts of the Iliad, including all the dialogue, to you from the translation by Lang, Leaf, and Myers. It's available free online since its copyright has expired. I've linked to it in the show notes, where you'll also find links to some more modern translations should you like to do your own Iliad read-through. The Iliad is very dense poetry, and it's from a very ancient culture, one very different from anything we're familiar with in the modern world. Therefore, I'll go on tangents to explain some of the more confusing or intriguing historical, religious, and cultural aspects we'll come across. These tangents are what makes this more than just a simple audiobook podcast, and they will help you get so much more out of the Iliad. I'm not a professional scholar, but I am a very well-read amateur, and this is how I first read the Iliad, pausing here and there to ask, why? Why are the characters doing these strange things? Getting a handle on why the characters in the Iliad are doing some of the things they're doing will help us understand their motivations, and this will uncover the very human story buried beneath all the confusing cultural practices, divine intervention, and over-the-top drama in the Iliad. Today in Book 3, we will get in-depth looks at two of the most important characters of the Iliad, Alexandros, also known as Paris, the young prince of Troy who kidnapped the Greek queen of Sparta, and Helen, that kidnapped queen, the famous woman whose beauty is said to have launched 1,000 ships, although if you were counting in Book 2's catalog of ships, you'd realize it was actually 1,186 ships. And we'll see Helen's first husband, the Greek king Menelaus, facing off against Paris in the first duel of the Iliad. Let's start off with a quick recap of Book 2 to set the stage. Book 2 was dominated by Agamemnon and his insecurity as a leader, especially in the immediate aftermath of his having driven the Greeks' best warrior, Achilles, out of the war in Book 1. It started with a dream Agamemnon was having, a good dream, he thought. In this dream, Agamemnon believed he was receiving a message directly from Zeus, telling him that the path was finally clear for him to defeat the Trojans and take their walled city that very next morning. Agamemnon was only partially right, however, in his interpretation of this dream, because while it was a message sent directly from Zeus, it was a false dream, sent to deceive him into committing his forces to a battle that he could not and would not win. As readers, we know that Zeus is working against Agamemnon to fulfill the prayer of Achilles to bring suffering upon the Greeks for Agamemnon's shaming of him in Book 1. However, Agamemnon never considered doubting the veracity of the dream, which was foolish of him. As a tricky old conniver himself, he should have seen it coming. But like I said, he's a tricky old guy, and so Agamemnon immediately decided to use this dream as a way to test the loyalty of his army. After having let only the other leaders, such as Odysseus, Nestor, and Ajax in on the plan, Agamemnon had the whole army brought before him, where he announced that the war had become unwinnable and that they should all just go home. Let's see how many of these guys are willing to follow me into battle, he thought, and we can purge out the handful of unfaithfuls and have a stronger army left afterwards. Well, it turned out he had been right to doubt their loyalty, but he had seriously underestimated how very disloyal they had become, because the men began to scramble into their ships immediately and started shoving off for home. It was only with the intervention of Athene, who prodded Odysseus into action, that the mutiny was stopped. After turning things around with some brilliant oration, and a lot of beating people with the royal scepter, Odysseus turned the army over to Agamemnon again, who marched them out upon the field of battle. And that's where the action of Book 2 ended. The final portion of Book 2 was taken up with the famous, and from a narrative sense very odd, Catalog of Ships, which is a listing of the various ships, commanded by which Greek leaders, came from which cities, and with how many men. There's a similar section at the end, listing the Trojans and their allies, although most of them wouldn't have come by ship to Troy, being either citizens of Troy itself, or those of various other nations in Asia Minor who more likely would have traveled here by land. The catalog provided ancient listeners of the Iliad a who's who of the major combatants on both sides. If you look in the show notes under Resources, Item 6 is a map by Jason Kotke showing exactly where all the Greeks and where the Trojan allies came from. This provides a similar overview of the combatants and their origins, but in visual format. Book 3 opens with the Greeks marching out upon the field to meet the Trojans in battle. Now when they were arrayed, each company with their captains, the Trojans march with clamor and with shouting like unto birds, even as when there goeth up before heaven a clamor of cranes, which flee the coming of winter and sudden rain, and fly with clamor towards the streams of ocean, bearing slaughter and fate to the pygmy men, and in early morn offer cruel battle. But on the other side march the Achaeans in silence, breathing courage, eager at heart to give succor man to man. Even as when the south wind sheddeth mist over the crests of a mountain, mist unwelcome to the shepherd, but to the robber better than night, and a man can see no further than he casteth a stone, even so thick arose the gathering dust clouds at their tread as they went, and with all speed they advanced across the plain. The noisy, shouting Trojans are contrasted to the Greeks, silent, breathing courage, as the two armies array themselves for battle. This is not the only time we'll see the noisy Trojans compared to the grim, silent Greeks. The Trojans and their allies are composed of various nations speaking different languages, while the Greeks share a single language. This certainly must have contributed to a difference in how much chatter and communication went on. And that last phrase, eager at heart to give succor man to man, or as Green's 2015 translation puts it, all determined to stand firm, each one by another, refers to the need in the melee battles of the time for soldiers to stay near each other and provide aid and protection to one another, to not let the line break. However, as we'll see throughout the Iliad, rather than focusing on overall troop movements and battle lines, the Iliad's narrative more often concentrates on individual heroes facing off one-to-one. Finally, that weird bit about pygmy warriors fighting cranes. This is a notion that pops up here and there in Greek mythology, the cranes versus pygmies. There seems to have been some belief, whether it was taken seriously or not, that a mythological race of tiny people, pygmies, so called because they were 1 pygmy tall, which is defined as the distance between the elbow and the hand. They lived in the far corners of the world, either in India or in Ethiopia, and that these tiny people were forever engaged in a war against the cranes, which would be seen migrating off to those southern lands each year, supposedly to renew their war against the pygmies. This is not a major component of Greek mythology. It just seems to be a whimsical idea that crops up now and then. If you'd like to read a very, very thorough analysis of this cranes and pygmy simile, look in the show notes for a paper by Muellner titled The Simile of the Cranes and Pygmies, a Study of Homeric Metaphor. So when they were now come nigh an onset on each other, godlike Alexandros played champion to the Trojans, wearing upon his shoulders panther skin and curved bow and sword, and he brandished 2 bronze-headed spears and challenged all the chieftains of the Argives to fight him man to man in deadly combat. But when Menelaus, dear to Ares, marked him coming in the forefront of the multitude with long strides, then even as a lion is glad when he lighteth upon a great carcass, a horned stag, or a wild goat that he hath found, being an hungered, and so he devoureth amain, even though the fleet hounds and lusty youths set upon him. Even thus was Menelaus glad when his eyes beheld godlike Alexandros, for he thought to take vengeance upon the sinner. So straightway he leapt in his armor from his chariot to the ground. At the forefront of the Trojan army is Prince Alexandros, aka Paris, making a gaudy show of himself. He's wearing a leopard skin cloak, which is ostentatious and a sign of vanity. Playing the hero, Paris challenges any of the Greeks to meet him one-on-one in battle, as well he might, as the man whose decision to kidnap the Greek queen Helen and steal her treasure has led them all into this war. Wasting no time, Menelaus, the man whose wife Paris abducted, takes up the challenge, being compared to a hungry lion. This is what Menelaus has been waiting for. Years after having come home to find his wife missing, kidnapped by Alexandros, Menelaus followed him here across the sea to Troy, through battle and hardships innumerable, and now, finally, Menelaus comes face to face with his enemy. We are preparing for the first duel of the Iliad, which forms the heart of Book 3, and whose outcome will set up Book 4. But when godlike Alexandros marked him appear amid the champions, his heart was smitten, and he shrank back into the host of his comrades, avoiding death. And even as a man that hath seen a serpent in a mountain glade starteth backward, and trembling seetheth his feet beneath him, and he retreateth back again, and paleness hath hold of his cheeks, even so did godlike Alexandros, for fear of Atreus' son, shrink back into the throng of lordly Trojans. But Hector beheld and upbraided him with scornful words. Ill Paris, most fair in semblance, thou deceiver, woman mad! Would thou hadst been unborn, and died unwed. Yea, that were my desire, and it were far better than thus to be our shame, and looked at askance of all men. I ween that the flowing-haired Achaeans laugh, deeming that a prince is our champion only because a goodly favor is his. But in his heart is there no strength, nor any courage. Art thou indeed such an one that in thy seafaring ships thou didst sail over the deep with the company of thy trusty comrades, and in converse with strangers didst bring back a fair woman from a far country, one that was by marriage daughter to warriors that bear the spear, that she might be a sore mischief to thy father and city and all the realm, but to our foes a rejoicing, and to thyself a hanging of the head? And canst thou not indeed abide Menelaus, dear to Ares? Thou mayest see what sort of warrior he is, whose lovely wife thou hadst. Thy lyre will not avail thee, nor the gifts of Aphrodite, those thy locks and fair favor, when thou grovelest in the dust. But the Trojans are very cowards, else ere this hadst thou donned a robe of stone for all the ill thou hast wrought. Paris's show of courage is quickly revealed to be just that, a show. When Menelaus steps forward to accept Paris's boastful challenge, Paris shrinks backward into the line of Trojan soldiers. Hector, Paris's older brother and the most respected warrior among the Trojans, is ashamed and angered at his brother's cowardice. Hector is an amazing warrior, one of the best we'll see, and he fights for Troy out of a sense of duty, not out of love for his brother Paris, and certainly not because he believes that defending his brother's marriage by kidnapping is right. Hector doesn't hold anything back when he calls Paris out in front of both armies. Ill Paris, most fair in semblance, thou deceiver, woman mad, would thou hadst been unborn and died unwed. Hector goes on to say that the Greeks are laughing at the Trojans now, that Paris is only among their champions because he's good-looking, not because he has any courage, and says that the gifts of Aphrodite, that is, Paris's good looks, won't be of any use to him against the superior warrior Menelaus. Finally, Hector concludes by telling all the Trojans that they are all cowards. Otherwise, they would have given Paris a robe of stone, meaning that they should have stoned him to death for all the trouble he's caused them, if they'd had the courage. And godlike Alexandros made answer to him again. Hector, since in measure thou chidest me and not beyond measure, thy heart is ever keen, even as an axe that pierceth a beam at the hand of a man that shapeth a ship's timber with skill, and thereby is the man's blow strengthened. Even such is thy heart undaunted in thy breast. Cast not in my teeth the lovely gifts of golden Aphrodite. Not to be flung aside are the gods' glorious gifts that of their own good will they give, for by his desire no man can win them. But now, if thou wilt have me do battle and fight, make the other Trojans sit down and all the Achaeans, and set ye me in the midst, and Menelaus dear to Ares, to fight for Helen and all her wealth. And whichsoever shall vanquish and gain the upper hand, let him take all the wealth aright, and the woman, and bear them home, and let the rest pledge friendship and sure oaths, so that ye may dwell in deep-soiled Troy, and let them depart to Argos pasture land of horses, and Achaia home of fair women. Paris does not refute Hector's insults, but simply says that the gifts of the gods are not to be thrown away, regardless of whether one would have chosen them or not. And in his case, it's the gifts of Aphrodite he's referring to. His good looks that make him attractive to women, but did not make him much of a warrior. And let's take a little digression here into Paris as a character. Paris seems to me to be a frustratingly passive person, a guy who just lucked into a good situation and just plans to continue coasting on his luck. He just accepts situations as they are. Maybe that has to do with his background. Paris was raised in the countryside by a herdsman named Agelaus. Now, how did a son of the king of Troy end up being raised as a shepherd? Infant exposure, left in the hands of a third party, the cause of so much drama in Greek mythology. This shepherd Agelaus worked for Priam, king of Troy, around the time baby Paris was born, or to use his other name, Alexandros. Paris's wife Hecuba had had a dream that the child she bore wasn't actually a child, but a flaming torch, the very torch that would ignite and burn down the city of Troy. So when the child Alexandros was born, Priam made a difficult decision. Priam believed Hecuba's dream that this child would bring about the destruction of their city. So Priam gave the infant to Agelaus, instructing the herdsman to leave the child exposed in the wilderness to die, and to bring back the child's tongue as proof that he had been killed, that is, infant exposure. Now, if you know anything about Greek mythology, you know that you need to do this sort of thing yourself. You can never count on a cursed child to not show up again. The same thing happened with an infant known as Oedipus. Agelaus came back to Priam with a piece of tongue and told Priam that the child was dead. But this was a lie. In secret, the herdsman Agelaus raised Alexandros himself, and it was a dog's tongue that he gave to Priam as a false proof of the baby's death. Why two names, Paris and Alexandros? There are a few theories about this. One is that Paris is a reference to a Greek word, para, meaning backpack, which is what the herdsman would have carried the child around in. And this is a neat little theory. However, it relies on a folk etymology, which is a non-scholarly equating of two words based on a casual observation, which often results in a false idea of connection. And this para interpretation of Paris's name goes back to ancient times. Uncovering some hidden meaning in words seems to have been very important in ancient Greeks, and writers went to great lengths to find meanings in words, especially in foreign names of people, places, and things that would elicit some understanding to Greek listeners. Unfortunately, their efforts at connecting the meanings of foreign words to some Greek root were not very scientific, and so we have to be cautious about these folk etymologies that we've inherited from ancient times. You can read more about this phenomenon in a paper by Munson titled Black Doves Speak, Herodotus and the Languages of the Barbarians, which I've linked to in the show notes. Now, more convincing is the suggestion that the name Paris isn't a Greek word or relatable to a Greek word at all, but rather of Luwian origin, a language of the Hittite Empire of what is now Turkey. The real historical city of Troy was in all likelihood associated with the Hittites as a vassal state in some manner, and inscriptions in the Luwian language have been found at the site of Troy. In the Luwian language, the second part of the name Paris means man, and this is true for the name Alexandros. And this suggests an intentionality in giving this one character these two names in different languages. Author De Jong, in the paper Paris Alexandros in the Iliad, points out that there is a fairly consistent pattern in the Iliad of this character being referred to as Paris by his fellow Trojans, but as Alexandros by the Greeks. Alexandros, or in English, Alexander, is a very common Greek name. It was in antiquity, and of course, we still find it very commonly today. Notably, Helen refers to him as Alexandros, reinforcing her Greek nationality. But still, why two different names in use? Author John Scott, in his very dated 1913 paper titled Paris and Hector in Tradition and in Homer, says that all the other Trojan characters have very Greek names, and that the name Paris is the only foreign, non-Greek name. This does not seem to be entirely correct, and it may be a relic of how little was known of Luwian language at the time. That, plus his confusing folk etymologies with actual name meanings. For instance, we now know that Paris's father Priam bore a name of Luwian origin. The name Priam seems to be related to a Luwian word meaning exceptionally courageous, and has been attested as an actual name in use by that culture. But again, little was known of the Luwian language back when John Scott was writing. However, Scott's main point still makes a lot of sense to me. And so I want to emphasize this, which is that the author of the Iliad invented the character of Hector as a less morally problematic protagonist for the Trojans, to take the primary place of Paris as their champion. And there may still be something to this argument, because Paris is difficult to see as a hero, with his history as a kidnapper and a thief, his parading around as a showboating playboy who runs off at the first sign of battle. And Paris is still the most foreign seeming of the Trojans, presenting himself in a luxurious panther pelt instead of solid bronze armor like all the other warriors. Perhaps significantly, unlike Paris and Priam, Hector's name does indeed seem to be of Greek origin, without a Luwian equivalent being attested to. Let's get back to Paris's personal history. When, as a young man, Paris was reunited with his father Priam, the old man was so overjoyed to find this son hadn't died that he immediately took his son in. This despite the horrible prophecy that Alexandros is the torch that will burn the city down. Remember that? Everyone in Troy except Priam and Alexandros seem to remember the prophecy. And that's why there's always this sense of doom surrounding Alexandros. They all know he will bring about their downfall. They just don't know when or how it will happen. And it's only Paris who seems to be oblivious to this impending doom, and Priam, who just can't bear another tragedy in his life, by ordering his now adult son's execution, even if it will mean far worse tragedy for them all later. And later on in his life, Paris got involved in a contest in which the god Ares cheated. And rather than getting angry or objecting to the cheating, Paris just casually gave Ares the crown, just said, Ares, you win. And it's that decision which gave Paris a reputation for fair judgment among the gods. Of course, fair from the god's perspective. Anyway, it's because of that Paris was then selected to be the judge in the beauty contest among the three goddesses, Aphrodite, Athene, and Hera. And by selecting Aphrodite as the most beautiful of these three, Paris was awarded Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, to be his wife. And he got Aphrodite's support. But he also earned the enmity of Hera and Athene. So Paris, overall, he's got this chill attitude. He's got this dependence on luck, which has always gone his way. He's gone from being a kid raised in the wilderness to finding out he's a prince of Troy, and then to being granted the most beautiful woman in the world by the goddess of love, with really no effort expended on his part for any of this. So there's a real contrast between Paris and his brother Hector. Paris's dependence on luck must have been infuriating to his older, more responsible brother Hector, who sees this doom of Troy slowly pressing in upon them, and with all his effort, there's nothing he can do to stop it. Paris really is a burning torch, and Troy is dry and full of kindling. Hector is a perfect hero, and unlike so many of the other heroes in the Iliad, he really is a good man who would fit our modern definition of a hero that includes a moral component. But there's nothing Hector can do to stop Paris's irresponsible behavior from leading to the destruction of their city. And Priam is helpless, elderly, and without the heart to make the hard decisions needed to save Troy. Priam can no longer bear the thought of destroying his son, despite the consequences. So everyone is locked into their fates now, and it's just a matter of how long the gods will toy with them before Troy's inevitable end. It really is a tragic situation for the Trojans, tragic in the original Greek sense of the word, in which fate marches people to their dooms. Part of Aristotle's definition of tragedy includes the phrase, through pity and fear, it effects relief, that is catharsis, to such and similar emotions. But that's catharsis for us as the audience of the tragedy. There's only suffering for the characters within the tragedy. And so, while Paris is going to drive Hector nuts throughout the Iliad, at this moment, when Paris finally does accept a duel with Menelaus, a duel that Paris initiated by strutting around proudly and issuing the challenge himself, Hector is placated and maybe just a teeny bit proud of his little brother. And Hector rejoiced greatly to hear his saying, and went into the midst and restrained the battalions of the Trojans, with his spear grasped by the middle, and they all sate them down. But the flowing-haired Achaeans kept shooting at him, aiming with arrows and casting stones. But Agamemnon, king of men, cried aloud, "Refrain, ye Argives, shoot not, ye sons of the Achaeans, for Hector of the glancing helm hath set himself to say somewhat." Paris has told Hector, "Sure, let's set up a duel, me against Menelaus. You arrange the details, and whichever one of us wins, that's who will keep Helen and the treasure I stole from Sparta, and the war will be over." And this seems simple enough, but you might notice we're only in book 3 of 24, so that should be a clue that it doesn't end up being quite so simple. And they refrained from battle and made silence speedily. And Hector spake between the two hosts, "Hear of me, Trojans and well-grieved Achaeans, the saying of Alexandros, for whose sake strife hath come about. He biddeth the other Trojans and all the Achaeans to lay down their goodly armor on the bounteous earth, and himself in the midst, and Menelaus, dear to Ares, to fight alone for Helen and all her wealth. And whichsoever shall vanquish and gain the upper hand, let him take all the wealth aright, and the woman, and bear them home. But let all of us pledge friendship and sure oaths." So spake he, and they all kept silence and were still. Then in their midst spake Menelaus of the loud war cry, "Hearken ye now to me too, for into my heart most of all is grief entered. And I deem that the parting of Achaeans and Trojans hath come at last, seeing ye have endured many ills because of my quarrel and the first sin of Alexandros. And for whichsoever of us death and fate are prepared, let him lie dead. And be ye all parted with speed. Bring ye 2 lambs, one white ram and one black ewe, for earth and sun, and let us bring one for Zeus, and call hither great Priam, that he may pledge the oath himself, seeing he hath sons that are overweening and faithless, lest any transgression do violence to the oath of Zeus. For young men's hearts are ever lifted up. But wheresoever an old man entereth in, he looketh both before and after, whereby the best issue shall come for either side." So spake he, and Achaeans and Trojans were glad, deeming that they should have rest from grievous war. So they refrained their chariots to the ranks, and themselves alighted and doffed their arms. And these they laid upon the earth, each close to each, and there was but small space between. And Hector sent 2 heralds to the city with all speed, to bring the lambs, and to call Priam. And Lord Agamemnon sent forth Talthybios to go to the hollow ships, and bade him to bring a ram, and he was not disobedient to noble Agamemnon. Hector issues the challenge for Paris, and Menelaus accepts it. To sanctify the duel, Menelaus calls for the presence of Priam as a leader of the Trojans. Agamemnon, the Greek leader, is already here on the battlefield. And Hector calls for sacrificial lambs, not just a turn of phrase, but literal lambs, one black for the earth, one white for the sky, and a third for Zeus. The 2 sides agree to abide by the results of the duel, and with the sacrifice made to the gods, they are calling for the gods themselves to pursue with vengeance either side if it fails to honor the results of the duel. This duel, with the kings of each side and the gods as witnesses, is the heart of Book 3. The duel's outcome and the controversy surrounding it will have repercussions throughout the rest of the Iliad on the trust and honor each side sees the other as conducting the war with. We are waiting for Priam to arrive now. As leader of the Trojans, his presence is necessary to finalize the sacrifice prior to the duel. Next, the scene will shift to Troy in order for us to follow Priam on his way out to witness the sacrifice. But we're going back in time a bit, so we can start by following the conversation that Priam had been having with Helen, which will end at the point where Priam is requested to join the other leaders on the battlefield for the sacrifice. This next section is where we get our best look at Helen, and it's one of my very favorite parts of the Iliad. This wonderful scene starts with Helen in her home, where, at the instigation of the goddess Iris, she goes up onto the walls of Troy, where she will have this lovely interaction with King Priam. Let's pause here, though, and take this opportunity to do an in-depth look at Helen to complement the one we've already done for Paris. I don't think any character in Greek mythology has been as maligned or misunderstood as Helen. Who is this mysterious woman at the heart of the Trojan War? Accounts vary, but Helen is generally said to have been born along with 3 other siblings. Her sister, Clytemnestra, who married Agamemnon, and who's back in Greece right now having an affair with Agamemnon's cousin. And her twin brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, or you may have heard of Polydeuces by his Roman name, Pollux. The twins are sadly dead by this time, but Helen doesn't know this yet. The mother of all four was Leda, queen of Sparta in many versions of Helen's story. In other versions, her mother was the goddess Nemesis, who was just as negative as her name sounds, an avenger goddess, there to strike down those whose pride requires punishment. It's commonly held that the father of Helen and Polydeuces was Zeus, who visited Leda in the form of a swan, which was one of his more innovative forms, but by no means the strangest. This divine parentage gives Helen and Polydeuces a higher status, and there are strong suggestions that Helen was originally a goddess herself in mythology, and only in later retellings, and as culpability for the war was attributed to her behavior, was she recast as a mortal woman. The father of Clytemnestra and Castor was Tyndareus, the human king of Sparta, who of course raised all four children because Zeus just went around fathering, not actually being a father. Because Zeus had been in swan form, the children hatched from eggs. As a child, Helen was abducted by the Athenian cultural hero Theseus, and it was her brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, who must have also been children at the time, who rescued her. And once she was older, Helen got to choose her husband, which of course was unusual for the time, and she chose Menelaus. Then Paris was, quote-unquote, awarded her by Aphrodite, despite the fact that she and he were both already married to other people at the time, and she hadn't been asked about it. She just got abducted for a second time in her life. Now, here's where we get into the moral dimension of the character of Helen. There was a lot of discussion in ancient times about how much blame Helen had to bear for leaving Menelaus and for starting the Trojan War. Did she seduce Paris? Did she choose to go with Paris? Is she a symbol of excess beauty or feminine wiliness or duplicity? Aristotle, in his work called the Nicomachean Ethics, agrees with the elders of Troy, who think Helen should be sent back to the Greeks. For Aristotle, she's just too beautiful, so beautiful that she's out of balance, and therefore a cause of trouble. Most of the arguments about Helen's blameworthiness for the war start with at least one of these three faulty premises. 1. They blame Helen for the war, conveniently forgetting that women, even noble women like Helen, had little to no say in the directions their lives took at this time and in this culture. 2. They blame Helen for the war, ignoring that the gods in the Iliad, and in Helen's case especially Aphrodite, are taking their own actions, moving people like Helen around like pawns on a chessboard. Keep in mind that Aphrodite has awarded Helen to Paris as a prize. Just because Aphrodite is a goddess doesn't exempt her from the same terrible behavior toward women that we see from male characters in mythology. And finally, 3. They blame Helen for the war through arguments equating Helen with some symbol, whether a symbol of love or beauty or sexual desire, rather than considering her as a character, as a person who loved and feared and made decisions in the light of imperfect knowledge. However, as we'll see in the Iliad itself, the author here does treat Helen as a character, does treat her as a person, and if you pay attention, you can see that at least within the Iliad itself, if not Greek mythology more broadly, Helen is portrayed here as sympathetic and a whole person who was a victim of the gods and of fate and of the actions of the people around her, the human men and the immortal gods, both male and female. This is why the presentation of Helen here in Book 3 is so special. With how few female characters this story has, the author has taken great care to really take advantage of this one significant scene with Helen to draw her in a subtle, believable, and sympathetic way. And this Helen carries through into the later glimpses we'll get of her throughout the Iliad. So, after being awarded her, Paris had gone to Sparta and abducted Helen, which, as I mentioned, was the second abduction of her life. Why couldn't Aphrodite have just teleported Helen over to Troy? No idea. Doesn't seem like anyone should have even believed Paris when he said there had been such a contest, much less that he had any right to abduct someone as a result. And it's not like Aphrodite's treatment of Helen gets any better after subjecting her to a second abduction. As we'll see by the goddess's treatment of Helen here a little later in Book 3, it's very clear that Aphrodite is Paris's patron, not Helen's, and the goddess simply orders Helen around. Aphrodite is no feminist here in the Iliad. Fascinatingly, there is an alternate version of Helen's life in which she is not kidnapped by Paris and taken to Troy at all. nor does she remain in Sparta during the war, but rather Helen is hidden away in Egypt for the duration of the war, while Paris there in Troy only has an image of her, an eidolon, an image of the real Helen made up of nothing but air. This alternate version of Helen's story crops up in a number of places, including a mention in the history of Herodotus, and it's this Egyptian variant Helen who is portrayed in Euripides' play titled simply Helen, where Menelaus discovers the real Helen in Egypt after the war when his ship is blown off course and he lands there in Egypt. But wait, don't I have the real Helen in the ship? What's going on? It's fascinating. It's wonderful. Worth a read. A paper I read recently online titled "Did the Helen of the Homeric Odyssey Ever Go to Troy?" which is linked in the show notes, points out that in the Odyssey itself, there is a conspicuous lack of evidence against this Egypt theory, and in fact, some active support for it. For instance, in the Odyssey, which is set years after the Iliad, Menelaus and Helen are back in Greece and are discussing the events of the war and the returns with Odysseus' son Telemachus. In the context of this conversation, Menelaus should most definitely mention having seen Helen at Troy, but instead he goes out of his way to not mention having seen her there, and instead attests to only having heard her voice from within the Trojan horse. And in another conversation in the Odyssey, Odysseus himself makes no mention of having seen her at all in a context when he probably should have. And when Helen herself speaks in the Odyssey, she mentions having been in Egypt, and then she gives them the exotic drugs that she brought back from there. According to the Eidolon version of the Helen story, the false Eidolon Helen flies up into the sky and returns to the air, to the nothingness of which she was made, once the real Helen is discovered in Egypt. Speaking of Eidolons, or the notion of a phantom Helen, throughout the Iliad we come across numerous instances of the gods taking different forms for various reasons, or even creating false images. We've already seen the false dream image of Nestor that appeared in a dream to Agamemnon. So the idea that Helen, throughout the entirety of the war, is herself a false image is not really outside the bounds of this story's logic. Ultimately, though, it doesn't really matter whether the real Helen is here in Troy or not. Clearly, the gods intend for this war to continue, so both sides are trapped in this conflict. Why I kind of like this strange theory of an Eidolon Helen is because it is much more fair to the character of Helen, who so often gets the blame for the war. It's nice to think that instead of having to spend the entirety of the war in a city full of people who hated her, she was maybe in Egypt, relaxing, becoming friends with Queen Polydamna, who introduced her to various healing herbs and drugs and whatnot, cruising down the Nile on a barge in style, getting a lot more enjoyment out of life than the Helen of Troy seems to get. She deserved a better life like that. Let's resume the text as the goddess Iris approaches Helen. Now Iris went with a message to white-armed Helen in the likeness of her husband's sister, the spouse of Antenor's son, even her that Lord Helicaon, Antenor's son, had to wife, Laodice, fairest favored of Priam's daughters. And in the hall she found Helen weaving a great purple web of double woof, and embroidering thereon many battles of horse-taming Trojans and mail-clad Achaeans, that they had endured for her sake at the hands of Ares. So fleet-footed Iris stood by her side and said, "Come hither, dear lady, that thou mayest see the wondrous doings of horse-taming Trojans and mail-clad Achaeans. They that erst waged tearful war upon each other in the plain, eager for deadly battle, even they sit now in silence, and the battle is stayed, and they lean upon their shields, and the tall spears are planted by their sides. But Alexandros and Menelaus, dear to Ares, will fight with their tall spears for thee, and thou wilt be declared the dear wife of him that conquereth." So spake the goddess, and put into her heart sweet longing for her former husband and her city and parents. The messenger goddess Iris appears to Helen in the form of Lady Laodice, her sister-in-law. Helen has been in her room working on a web, a woven textile with imagery of the war. Laodice asks Helen to come up on the wall. It doesn't appear that Iris's disguise is detected. From Helen's perspective, It is her sister-in-law, Laodike, simply calling her out to see the duel. It's also not specified which god or goddess has sent Iris, who is always a messenger goddess, sent to enact some other god's will. So the how and why of it are a bit of a mystery, but we can assume that one of the gods has sent Iris to Helen. Iris, as Laodike, explains to Helen that Menelaus and Paris, her former and current husbands, are about to battle for her, and she'll be sent with whichever is the winner. As all this weren't enough, the goddess put into her heart sweet longing for her former husband and her city and parents. So Helen is being manipulated and controlled, even emotionally. But she puts on a veil and, weeping, ascends to the top of the city wall, accompanied by two of her maids. Forthwith she veiled her face in shining linen, and hastened from her chamber, letting fall a round tear, not unattended, for there followed with her two handmaidens, Aithre, daughter of Pythias, and ox-eyed Clymene. Then came she straightway to the place of the Scaean gates. And they that were with Priam and Panthous and Thymoetes and Lampos and Clytios and Hicetaon of the stock of Ares, Alcaligon withal and Antenor, twain sages, being elders of the people, sat at the Scaean gates. These had now ceased from battle for old age, yet were they right good orators, like grasshoppers that in a forest sit upon a tree and utter their lily-like voice. Even so sat the elders of the Trojans upon the tower. Now when they saw Helen coming to the tower, they softly spake winged words one to the other. Small blame is it that Trojans and well-grieved Achaeans should for such a woman long time suffer hardships. Marvelously like is she to the immortal goddesses to look upon. Yet even so, though she be so goodly, let her go upon their ships, and not stay to vex us and our children after us. We've now followed Helen to the top of the Scaean or southern gate, where she finds King Priam and some of his elderly men, all too old to endure battle themselves, but still talkers. Homer compares them to grasshoppers or cicadas, noisily chirping away at one another. Where I'm from in the Midwest, in summer evenings, the trees are filled with cicadas droning on one to another. So this is a very effective bit of imagery for me. On seeing Helen, some of Priam's friends are not very friendly, but this is not surprising given the 9 years of suffering the city has endured. What is, however, surprising is how Priam treats Helen. So said they, and Priam lifted up his voice and called to Helen, "Come hither, dear child, and sit before me, that thou mayest see thy former husband and thy kinsfolk and thy friends. I hold thee not to blame, nay, I hold the gods to blame, who brought on us the dolorous war of the Achaeans. So mayest thou now tell me, who is this huge hero, this Achaean warrior so goodly and great? Of a truth, there are others even taller by a head, yet did mine eyes never beheld a man so beautiful, nor so royal, for he is like unto one that is a king." Priam has invited Helen to come sit beside him, to see out on the field below her former husband and her relatives, and to tell him what she knows about the Greeks. And Priam tells Helen that he doesn't blame her for the war that's come about. Let's keep in mind the city that Helen lives in, besieged, a city surrounded, cut off from the world by Helen's own people, her former husband and his relatives and friends, here to recover her. She's living in a city full of people who see her as the enemy. And so that Priam, the king of this city, that he would extend this kindness to Helen. This is really a lovely moment between a fatherly figure and a lonely woman who really needs this kindness. Priam is one of only two people, Hector being the other, who treat Helen kindly. It's as if, with age and hardship, Priam has come to see that fate will come for everyone in their time, but that doesn't mean that we need to so associate our own identities with what fate has dished out to us. From Priam's perspective as a wise man who's seen a lot of life and a lot of suffering, we can be kind, we can be true to ourselves, and we can treat one another well. He is an older, wiser, kinder version of his son Paris. Neither Priam nor Paris are men of action, and neither intentionally harms others. And maybe these similarities are why Priam protects Paris among all his many children, despite knowing it will be the doom of his city. Priam will be his kind self, despite the injustice and manipulation of the gods. With age, he's come to see that this is the control he can exert over an otherwise fate-driven life, how he chooses to react to events, and how he chooses to treat those around him. There's a lot of wisdom in that. So now we are beginning another one of those little episodes in the Iliad that has its own scholarly name. This is the Tychoscopia, the viewing from the walls, as Priam and Helen sit atop the walls of Troy and view the men on the battlefield below. Here, Priam asks Helen who the various Greek heroes are, who they can both see down on the field, and Helen gives him and us as the readers her perspective on them. Before answering him, though, Helen expresses her love for Priam, which is understandable enough as he's the kind support she needs in a city full of people who hate her. But she also abases herself. She wishes she was dead. She wishes she had never followed Paris here to Troy, or that she hadn't left her daughter Hermione, who must herself be growing up by now. Helen has been caught up by fate from the moment of her birth, and unlike Priam, she doesn't have the age yet to see that it isn't her fault. And we'll get into the conversation between Priam and Helen shortly, because it's beautiful and kind, and because we'll be able to see the Greek heroes through Helen's eyes. But first, let's address the question that this scene, the Tychoscopia, has been raising in readers' minds since antiquity. How is it reasonable to imagine that now, 10 years into the war, Priam is only now asking for Helen to identify these various Greeks who have been surrounding his city for a decade? And my answer is simply that it's not reasonable. And alternatively, to think that Priam is only making conversation with Helen isn't sufficient rationale for this episode to occur at this point in the narrative. Rather, it's quite possible that this scene was placed here as a result of a somewhat shaky editorial decision when the Iliad was being collected and collated into the standard text that we have from among various loose pieces of legend about the Trojan War throughout all of its various stages. And if this is the case, then the Tychoscopia episode originally would have occurred much sooner in the timeline of the war, much earlier than the other events that we're covering here in the Iliad. But the compiler or compilers of the Iliad they must have felt, that the Tychoscopia was just too good, too valuable a piece to let go when the Iliad was being put together. And so they seemingly jammed it in here where it doesn't really make a lot of logical sense, but it does make a lot of emotional sense. It feels right for us as the audience to get this perspective on the heroes now and to see them through Helen and Priam's eyes at this point in time. And this is the perspective of Stephanie Jameson in her paper titled Draupadi on the Walls of Troy, Iliad 3 from an Indic Perspective, where she compares the Tychoscopia episode to examples in Indic law and culture, especially in the Mahabharata, where marriage by abduction, of which we could certainly classify Helen's marriage to Paris, can be challenged by a counter-abduction, such as is now being proposed by Menelaus, if he should win the duel about to be fought against Paris. Jameson points out that the events taking place here in Book 3 actually correspond to a similar narrative in Indic literature, and they follow the same legal logic that it does in that other example, which requires the woman being wooed and counter-wooed to speak, as we will hear Helen speak. And strangely enough, both narratives even end with the mentioning of a pair of twins. In the case of the Iliad, it will be when Helen will ask about the whereabouts of her brothers, Castor and Polydeuces. And so, to repeat Priam's question to Helen, tell me, who is this huge hero, this Achaean warrior so goodly and great? Of a truth, there are others even taller by a head, yet mine eyes never beheld a man so beautiful nor so royal, for he is like unto one that is a king. And Helen, fair among women, spake and answered him, Reverend art thou to me, and dread, dear father of my lord. Would that sore death had been my pleasure when I followed thy son hither, and left my home and my kinsfolk and my daughter in her girlhood, and the lovely company of mine age fellows. But that was not so, wherefore I pine with weeping. Now will I tell thee that whereof thou askest me and inquirest. That is Atrides, wide-ruling Agamemnon, one that is both a goodly king and a mighty spearman. And he was husband's brother to me. Ah, shameless me, if ever such an one there was. So said she, and the old man marveled at him and said, Ah, happy Atrides, child of fortune, blessed of heaven, now know I that many sons of the Achaeans are subject to thee. Erewhile fared I to Phrygia, the land of vines, and there I saw that the men of Phrygia, they of the fleet steeds, were very many, even the hosts of Otreus and godlike Mygdon, that were then encamped along the banks of Sangarios. For I too, being their ally, was numbered among them on the day that the Amazons came, the peers of men. Yet were not even they so many as are the glancing-eyed Achaeans. And next the old man saw Odysseus and asked, Come now, tell me of this man too, dear child. Who is he? Shorter by a head than Agamemnon, son of Atreus, but broader of shoulder and of chest to behold. His armor lieth upon the bounteous earth, and himself like a bellwether rangeth the ranks of warriors. Yea, I liken him to a thick-fleeced ram, ordering a great flock of white ewes. Then Helen, sprung of Zeus, made answer to him, Now this is Laertes' son, crafty Odysseus, that was reared in the realm of Ithaca, rugged though it be, and is skilled in all the ways of wile and cunning device. Then sage Antenor made answer to her, Lady, verily the thing thou sayest is true indeed. For erst came goodly Odysseus hither, also on an embassage for thee, in the company of Menelaus, dear to Ares, and I gave them entertainment and welcomed them in my halls, and learnt the aspect of both and their wise devices. Now when they mingled with the Trojans in the assembly, while all stood up, Menelaus overpassed them all by the measure of his broad shoulders. But when both sat down, Odysseus was the more stately. And when they began to weave the web of words and counsel in the face of all, then Menelaus harangued fluently in few words, but very clearly, seeing he was not long of speech, neither random, though in years he was the younger. But whenever Odysseus, full of wiles, rose up, he stood and looked down, with eyes fixed upon the ground, and waved not his staff, whether backwards or forwards, but held it stiff, like to a man of no understanding. One would deem him to be churlish, and naught but a fool. But when he uttered his great voice from his chest, and words like unto the snowflakes of winter, then could no mortal man contend with Odysseus. Then marveled we not thus to behold Odysseus' aspect. And thirdly, the old man saw Aias, and asked, Who is then this other Achaean warrior, goodly and great, preeminent among the Argives by the measure of his head and broad shoulders? And long-robed Helen, fair among women, answered, This is huge Aias, bulwark of the Achaeans. And on the other side, amid the Cretans, standeth Idomeneus like a god, and about him are gathered the captains of the Cretans. Oft did Menelaus, dear to Ares, entertain him in our house whene'er he came from Crete. And now I behold all the other glancing-eyed Achaeans, whom well I could discern and tell their names. But two captains of the host can I not see, even Castor, tamer of horses, and Polydeuces, the skillful boxer, mine own brethren, whom the same mother bare. Either they came not in the company from lovely Lacedaemon, or they came hither indeed in their seafaring ships, but will not now enter into the battle of the warriors, for fear of the many scornings and revilings that are mine. So said she, but them the life-giving earth held fast there in Lacedaemon, in their dear native land. So the first Greek hero viewed from the walls is Agamemnon, and he's described not as the tallest man out there, but very good-looking and with a regal air about him. I think of him as fitting the stereotypical physical description of a leader, but as we've already seen and will continue to see, he falls short in the actual behavior of a good leader. Odysseus is described as being less tall than Agamemnon, but with wider shoulders, and I like this bit, looking like a ram among white-fleeced ewes. So I picture Odysseus as a stocky man, darker, stronger, and someone who stands apart. It's a remarkably clear image I have of Odysseus. Next, they look at Aias, or Ajax the Great, Telamonian Aias, to distinguish him from the other Aias. Telamonian Aias is a huge man, and as we'll see, one who plays an important but primarily defensive role in battle. Helen's responses to Priam's questions about the Greeks become shorter. She goes quickly from Aias to Idomeneus, the leader of the Greeks from the island of Crete, who isn't described visually here, but is noted that he often came to Sparta, where he was a guest of Helen and Menelaus. And the audience in ancient times would have known that it was while Menelaus was in Crete visiting Idomeneus that Paris abducted Helen. But Helen answers Priam quickly because she's looking throughout the Greek ranks for two men in particular and not seeing them. Two warriors of particular renown whom one would certainly have expected to have found among the Greek army, her brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, the twins. And note how cautiously she asks after her brothers. But two captains of the host can I not see? Even Castor, tamer of horses, and Polydeuces, the skillful boxer. Helen is afraid that her brothers are back at the camp, ashamed to show themselves out of embarrassment of her, which is a tragic insight into her mind. And I'll point out, obviously not with the insights of someone who's using her beauty to control others and drive men to slaughter one another in senseless battle, but rather they're the thoughts of a loving sister and a lonely, depressed person. The truth about her brothers doesn't occur to her. The audience in ancient times knew what Homer goes on to spell out for us, that in the time since she left Sparta, her brothers have died. They will not be able to rescue her from this abduction, like they did when Theseus abducted her as a child. Helen especially is depicted as someone suffering for the cruelty of her fate, and we can only hope she can come away with some comfort from this interaction with a kindly father figure in her otherwise lonely life. The Tychoscopia is drawing to a close now, the entirely too short time we get to spend with Helen and Priam, two of the most sensitively drawn characters in the Iliad. Now remember that back on the battlefield, they had been preparing a sacrifice to sanctify the upcoming duel between Menelaus and Paris, and therefore they would require the presence of Priam as leader of the Trojans. And we've now caught up with that moment as a herald approaches Priam. Meanwhile, were the heralds bearing through the city the holy oath offerings, 2 lambs and strong-hearted wine, the fruit of the earth, in a goatskin bottle. And the herald Idaeus bare the shining bowl and golden cups, and came to the old man and summoned him and said, Rise, thou son of Laomedon. The chieftains of the horse-taming Trojans and mail-clad Achaeans call on thee to go down to the plain, that ye may pledge a trusty oath. But Alexandros and Menelaus, dear to Ares, will fight with their long spears for the lady's sake, and let lady and treasure go with him that shall conquer. And may we that are left pledge friendship and trusty oaths, and dwell in deep-soiled Troy, and they shall depart to Argos, pasture land of horses, and Hellas, home of fair women. So said he, and the old man shuddered, and bade his companions yoke the horses, and they with speed obeyed. Then Priam mounted and drew back the reins, and by his side Antenor mounted the splendid chariot. So the two drave the fleet horses through the Scaean gates to the plain. And when they had come even to the Trojans and Achaeans, they went down from the chariots upon the bounteous earth, and marched into the midst of Trojans and Achaeans. Then forthwith rose up Agamemnon, king of men, and uprose Odysseus, the man of wiles. And the lordly heralds gathered together the holy oath offerings of the gods, and mingled the wine in a bowl, and poured water over the prince's hands. And Atreides put forth his hands, and drew his knife that hung ever beside his sword's great sheath, and cut the hair from the lambs' heads. And then the heralds portioned it among the chief of the Trojans and the Achaeans. Then in their midst Agamemnon lifted up his hands and prayed aloud, Father Zeus, that rulest from Ida, most glorious, most great, and thou Son, that seest all things and hearest all things, and ye rivers and thou earth, and ye that in the underworld punish men outworn. Whosoever sweareth falsely, be ye witnesses, and watch over the faithful oath. If Alexandros slay Menelaus, then let him have Helen to himself and all her possessions, and we will depart on our seafaring ships. But if golden-hair Menelaus slay Alexandros, then let the Trojans give back Helen and all her possessions, and pay the Argives the recompense that is seemly, such as shall live among men that shall be hereafter. But if so be that Priam and Priam's sons will not pay the recompense unto me, when Alexandros falleth, then will I fight on thereafter for the price of sin, and abide here till I compass the end of war. So said he, and cut the lambs' throats with the pitiless knife. Them he laid gasping upon the ground, failing of breath, for the knife had taken their strength from them. And next they drew the wine from the bowl into the cups, and poured it forth, and prayed to the gods that live forever. And thus would say many an one of Achaeans and Trojans, Zeus most glorious, most great, and all ye immortal gods, which folk soever be first to sin against the oath, may their brains be so poured forth upon the earth, even as this wine, theirs and their children's, and let their wives be made subject unto strangers. So spake they, but the son of Cronos vouchsafed not yet fulfillment. And in their midst Priam of the seed of Dardanos uttered his saying, Hearken to me, Trojans and well-grieved Achaeans. I verily will return back to windy Ilios, seeing that I can in no wise bear to behold with mine eyes my dear son fighting with Menelaus, dear to Ares. But Zeus knoweth, and all the immortal gods, for whether of the twain the doom of death is appointed. So spake the godlike man, and laid the lambs in his chariot, and entered in himself, and drew back the reins, and by his side Antenor mounted the splendid chariot. So they departed back again to Ilios. Priam arrived at the battlefield, and the sacrifice took place. Now, with the sacrifice over, the soldiers on both sides relax and take off their armor and seat themselves on the ground to watch the duel. After the sacrifice, Priam returned quickly to the city, saying that he couldn't bear to watch his son fighting with Menelaus, dear to Ares. Not a great endorsement for how he thinks Paris will do, but this might also just reflect on Priam in the way I imagine he sees his world, which is that the gods take actions and mortals suffer consequences enough already without heaping ourselves with even more suffering. So now they're almost ready to start the duel between Menelaus and Paris for Helen and for her treasure and for the ending of the war. It's not simply one-on-one combat, though. They're going to start by taking turns attacking each other. And this means they have to draw lots to determine randomly who gets to strike first and who will strike second. Hector, representing the Trojans, and Odysseus, representing the Greeks, mark out a spot for the duel, and lots, not specified what these items are. They might be pot shards, that is, broken pieces of pot. Those are often used in things like this in ancient times. These lots are placed in a helmet, and the people gathered, prayed that whoever it was who caused this war, Menelaus or Paris, would die in the duel, so that peace could return. Hector, son of Priam, and goodly Odysseus first meted out a space, and then they took the lots and shook them in a bronze-bound helmet to know whether of the twain should first cast his spear of bronze. And the people prayed and lifted up their hands to the gods, and thus would say many an one of Achaeans and Trojans, Father Zeus, that ruleth from Ida, most glorious, most great, whichsoe'er it be that brought this trouble upon both peoples, vouchsafe that he may die and enter the house of Hades, that so for us peace may be assured, and trusty oaths. So said they, and great Hector of the glancing plume shook the helmet, looking behind him, and quickly leapt forth the lot of Paris. Then the people sat them down by ranks, where each man's high-stepping horses and pictured armor lay. And upon his goodly shoulders Alexandros donned his beauteous armor, even he that was lord to Helen of the lovely hair. First upon his legs set he his greaves, beautiful, fastened with silver ankle clasps. Next upon his breast he donned the corslet of his brother Lycaon, and fitted it upon himself. And over his shoulders cast he his silver-studded sword of bronze, and then a shield great and sturdy. And on his mighty head he set a wrought helmet of horsehair crest, where'er the plume nodded terribly. And he took him a strong spear fitted to his grasp. And in likewise warlike Menelaus donned his armor. So Hector shook the helmet, and out flew the lot of his own brother, Paris, meaning Paris gets to strike first. And both men put on their armor, Menelaus in his worn, battle-tested gear, and Paris in his flashy gear. And I like to imagine this panther skin cloak is on. and of course a helmet with a big plume of horsehair bobbing from the top. Now Menelaus has to stand there while Paris throws his spear at him. So when they had armed themselves on either side in the throng, they strode between Trojans and Achaeans, fierce of aspect, and wonder came on them that beheld, both on the Trojans, tamers of horses, and on the well-greaved Achaeans. Then took they their stand, near together in the measured space, brandishing their spears in wrath, each against other. First, Alexandros hurled his far-shadowing spear, and smote on Atrides' round shield. But the bronze brake not through, for its point was turned in the stout shield. Next, Menelaus, son of Atreus, lifted up his hand to cast, and made prayer to Father Zeus. King Zeus, grant me revenge on him that was first to do me wrong, even on goodly Alexandros, and subdue thou him at my hands, so that many an one of men that shall be hereafter may shudder to wrong his host that hath shown him kindness. So Paris has casted his spear, and maybe didn't throw it all that hard because Menelaus just raised his shield and caught the spear. And now it's Menelaus' turn to throw. And he prayed to Zeus to help him finally get revenge on Paris. Menelaus poised his far-shadowing spear and hurled and smote on the round shield of the son of Priam. Through the bright shield went the ponderous spear, and through the inwrought breastplate it pressed on, and straight beside his flank the spear rent the tunic. But Paris swerved and escaped black death. Menelaus' cast is much harder than Paris, and was thrown with great anger. His spear breaks through Paris' shield and through his bronze breastplate and tears the clothing. It's only a last-minute swerve, dodge by Paris that saves the young man's life. Now it's a free-for-all. The lots only covered who got to attack first and second, and Menelaus draws his sword and comes at Paris. He is clearly the better warrior, older and battle-tested, and the years of war can be over in just a moment here. Then Atrides drew his silver-studded sword and lifted up his hand and smote the helmet ridge, but the sword shattered upon it into 3, yea, 4, and fell from his hand. Thereat Atrides looked up to wide heaven and cried, Father Zeus, surely none of the gods is crueler than thou. Verily, I thought to have gotten vengeance on Alexandros for his wickedness, but now my sword breaketh in my hand, and my spear sped from my grasp in vain, and I have not smitten him. So saying, he leapt upon him and caught him by his horsehair crest, and swinging him around, dragged him toward the well-greaved Achaeans, and he was strangled by the embroidered strap beneath his soft throat, drawn tight below his chin to hold down his helm. Now would Menelaus have dragged him away and won glory unspeakable, but that Zeus's daughter Aphrodite was swift to mark, and tore asunder for him the strap of slaughtered oxhide, so the helmet came away empty in his stalwart hand. Thereat Menelaus cast it with a swing toward the well-greaved Achaeans, and his trusty comrades took it up, and himself sprang back again, eager to slay him with spear of bronze. Menelaus striked, crashing his sword down upon Paris' helmet, but the sword shattered, and Menelaus loudly cursed Zeus. None of the gods is crueler than you, Zeus. But Menelaus was not to be stopped now. Before Paris had a chance to recover from that ringing blow upon his helmet, Menelaus grabbed Paris by the helmet's plume of horsehair, trying to strangle Paris by the helmet strap that's under his neck. And here, this is where Aphrodite intervened and snapped that helmet strap, and Paris escaped from Menelaus, who took a moment to throw Paris' helmet to the other Greeks. Remember, gathering stuff is gathering honor. And now Menelaus comes at Paris with a bronze spear. And Menelaus has another opportunity to end it all right now. But Aphrodite snatched up Paris very easily as a goddess may, and hid him in thick darkness, and set him down in his fragrant vaulted chamber, and herself went to summon Helen. Her she found on the high tower, and about her the Trojan women thronged. So with her hand she plucked her perfumed raiment, and shook it, and spake to her in the likeness of an aged dame, a wool comber, that was wont to work for her fair wool when she dwelt in Lacedaemon, whom too she greatly loved. Even in her likeness, fair Aphrodite spake, Come hither, Alexandros summons thee to go homeward. There he is in his chamber and inlaid bed, radiant in beauty and vesture. Nor wouldst thou deem him to be come from fighting his foe, but rather to be faring to the dance, or from the dance, or to just be resting and set down. So Aphrodite has intervened in this battle a second time. But the second time, it wasn't just snapping a helmet strap, but it's a big way. She has hidden Paris in a dark cloud, whisked him up into the air, dropped him into his own bedroom back inside the city of Troy. And the scene shifts then with her, where we're back up on the wall with Helen, who's been watching the duel. And Aphrodite is now there, taking on the form of an old woman that Helen knew back in Sparta. An old wool worker who would really have no business being here in Troy. Like, this is a zero effort disguise. And she says to Helen, "Oh, Helen, Paris is calling for you. He's in his bed. You'd never know. He's just in battle. He's all clean, looks great." Like, this makes no sense. So said she, and stirred Helen's soul within her breast. And when now she marked the fair neck and lovely breast and sparkling eyes of the goddess, she marveled straightway, and spake a word, and called upon her name. "Strange queen, why art thou desirous now to beguile me? Verily thou wilt lead me further on to some one of the peopled city of Phrygia, or lovely Maeonia, if there too thou hast perchance some other darling among mortal men. Because even now Menelaus hath conquered goodly Alexandros, and will lead me, accursed me, to his home. Therefore thou comest hither with guileful intent. Go and sit thou by his side, and depart the way of the gods. Neither let thy feet ever bear thee back to Olympus, but still be vexed for his sake, and guard him till he make thee his wife, or perchance his slave. But thither will I not go. That were a sinful thing, to array the bed of him. All the women of Troy will blame me hereafter, and I have griefs untold within my soul." So Helen notices that this isn't the old woman from Sparta who would have no business being here in Troy, but indeed it's Aphrodite, recognizes her by her beauty immediately, and confronts Aphrodite. "Strange queen, why art thou desirous to beguile me?" Helen is angry with Aphrodite. This is clearly a dirty trick the goddess is playing, intervening in the duel, now bringing more shame upon Helen by removing Paris from the battle. Helen asks now if she's going to lead me on to yet some farther place now that Paris has been defeated, rather than just letting Menelaus take me back to Sparta. And Helen refuses, absolutely refuses, this goddess to her face, to go to Paris now. "Everyone will hate me. Why don't you go to him, Aphrodite, and you become his wife, or even become his slave? I've got enough problems." Then in wrath, bright Aphrodite spake to her, "Provoke me not, rash woman, lest in mine anger I desert thee, and hate thee even as now I love thee beyond measure, and lest I devise grievous enmities between both, even betwixt Trojan and Achaean, and so thou perish in evil wise." So said she, and Helen sprung of Zeus was afraid, and went wrapped in her bright radiant vesture silently. And the Trojan women marked her not, and the goddess led the way. Now when they were come to the beautiful house of Alexandros, the handmaidens turned straightway to their tasks, and the fair lady went to the high-roofed chamber, and laughter-loving Aphrodite took for her a chair and brought it, even she the goddess, and set it before the face of Paris. There Helen took her seat, the child of Aegis-bearing Zeus, and with eyes turned askance, spake and showed her lord. "Thou comest back from battle. Would thou hadst perished there, vanquished of that great warrior that was my former husband. Verily it was once thy boast that thou wast a better man than Menelaus dear to Ares, in thy might of thine arm and thy spear. But go, now, challenge Menelaus dear to Ares to fight thee again, face to face. Nay, but I, even I, bid thee refrain, nor fight a fight with golden-haired Menelaus man to man, neither attack him recklessly, lest perchance thou fall to his spear anon." Aphrodite is a goddess. She's just not to be disobeyed. With a threat that she'll provoke the Greeks and the Trojans to both turn on her, Helen obeys. She has no choice. I don't think Helen has had many real choices in her life. Finding Paris in his bedroom, Helen is not happy to see him. She says to him that she wishes he had died in the duel, and wishes that he had been killed by the great man who was her former husband. And she initially tells Paris to go challenge Menelaus to another fight, but She stops herself and says, "Nope, don't do that. You'll just end up getting killed." And Paris made answer to her and said, "Chide not my soul, lady, with cruel taunts. For now indeed hath Menelaus vanquished me with Athene's aid. But another day may I do so unto him, for we too have gods with us. But come now, let us have joy of love upon our couch. For never yet hath love so enwrapped my heart, not even then when I first snatched thee from lovely Lacedaemon, and sailed with thee on my seafaring ships, and in the Isle of Cranae had conversed with thee upon thy couch in love, as I love thee now, and sweet desire taketh hold upon me." So saying, he led the way to the couch, and the lady followed with him. Thus laid they them upon their fretted couch, but Atrides the while strode through the host like to a wild beast, if anywhere he might set eyes on godlike Alexandros. But none of the Trojans or their famed allies could discover Alexandros to Menelaus dear to Ares. Yet surely did they in no wise hide him for kindness, could any have seen him, for he was hated of all, even as Black Death. So Agamemnon, king of men, spake among them there, "Hearken to me, Trojans and Dardanians and allies. Now is victory declared for Menelaus dear to Ares. Give ye back Helen of Argos and the possessions with her, and pay ye the recompense such as is seemly, that it may live even among men that shall be hereafter." So said Atrides, and all the Achaeans gave assent. So, meanwhile, while this scene is going on in Paris's bedroom, Menelaus is out on the battlefield, stalking back and forth like a wild beast, looking for Paris. And no one out there knows what happened. Paris was just suddenly not there anymore. And whether he's hiding among the Trojans again or he ran off, it doesn't matter to the Greeks what he did. Menelaus had been winning and clearly would have won, and he is still on the battlefield standing. So Agamemnon announces victory for the Greeks, and he demands that the Trojans produce Helen and her treasure and return these to them immediately. And the Greeks all cheer. "We've won the duel." The Trojans and their king Priam just sanctified an oath in which they agreed to end the war and return everything if we won. So bring forth the treasure, bring forth Helen. It's over. Of course, the Trojans might not see it that way. The Trojans may feel that the gods intervened, which they did, and that the duel had no formal outcome. And if that's the case, then isn't the truce over? This uncertainty is where Book 3 ends. The Greeks thinking that we're still technically under the truce declared for the duel, and that all that's left is for the Trojans to bring out Helen and the treasure. The Trojans, on the other hand, likely to argue that the duel was invalidated by the actions of the gods. And it's a precarious situation. It's likely to explode at any moment. And that is where Book 3 ends, and that is exactly where Book 4 will pick up. Until next time, this has been Daniel with Your Mythology Book Club. Thank you for listening.